I know we only had one lesson to go in the book of James, but that's going to have to wait until next week. Because as good as that passage was, it just doesn't match up with thinking about Thanksgiving. And this is one of those holidays that, as Brother David said, we kind of consolidate as a country down to one day, but it ought to be everyday life. But I wanted to share a message, and this psalm has been, for whatever reason, on my mind and I guess on my heart for several weeks now. My thoughts keep flashing back to the psalm, and I kind of came to the conclusion that it, as I looked at it and thought about it so much, that it really ties in well with the thoughts of this week. So as we look at this, we're going to be looking at Psalms chapter 23. We're going to be looking at what David writes, and I describe as a psalm of contentment, a psalm of comfort, a psalm of recognition. And to me, when you start putting those three things together and the things that tie to those, it really becomes a psalm of thanksgiving. And yet, psalm these days. We hear it a lot at funerals, or see it written in an obituary paper. And for the most part, it's almost gotten laid aside to being just a funeral notice psalm. If it's more than that, it's probably that it was one of the passages that we were drilled as young people, made to memorize, and some portion at least thereof we can still kind of bring out. May not be able to bring it all out word for word, but we know the thoughts of the psalm and we can quote parts of it. And yet, it's such a beautiful psalm that it really ought to be more than that. And so this morning, I want to revive this psalm in our minds as one of thanksgiving and one that we can use to guide us as we go into this week and really begin trying to take up and pause for a moment and remember everything that we have to be thankful for. I'm going to do a little bit different. As I read through this the first time, typically I read and use NIV. I'm going to read it from the King James Version as we read it as the entire context this morning. And then as I come back and start talking about the verses, I'm going to switch back to my NIV. But I'm going to give those traditionalists their King James Version this morning. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So let's take a little bit closer look at the thoughts that David presents and that he offers here. And he begins with examples that he draws from his youth, the time that he spent as a shepherd. It was something he was very familiar with, of the structure of it and how it was supposed to work. The shepherd leading his sheep, protecting his sheep, guiding them, taking care of them. And so David kind of takes and reverses the roles. Instead of being the shepherd that he was as a boy, he recognizes, I'm the sheep. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. That statement is one of recognition and of contentment, a statement of submission. He acknowledges that the role of God is the shepherd. He is the one who knows what's best. He is the one that knows where the best grazing is for his sheep, where the safe waters are. And we're going to talk about that as we get to these other verses, but he knows what dangers face him. He knows everything about business of taking care of sheep. God, you're the one who created us. You know everything there is to know about taking care of us. That's the acknowledgement that David makes. And then he says, because that's the case, I lack nothing. Might want some things, but he lacks nothing that he needs. And what a beautiful thought that God never leaves his children, his sheep, needing something. As Christians, God provides for us as well. 2 Peter, the first chapter, the third verse, Peter writes, his divine power has given us everything that we need for a godly life. That's similar to David's writing, isn't it? He's given me everything I need for the life of a sheep. He's given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. We've got a lot to be thankful for this week, because God has given us everything that we need up until this point in time. Everything we need to deal with the situations that we face, everything that we need to have life and to live it as godly children. Back to Psalm 23, David says there, verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the quiet waters. With God leading, David says, I'm able to be in the best of situations. He says, as a sheep, I have the best pastures for eating. Everything that I need for the nutrition, the health of my body, everything that God can provide for me. It's green and lush. It's good for eating. It's good for bedding. It's a safe place to be. Again, David looking at this from the perspective of the sheep. This is a statement about how things are always better when we follow God's way. He leads us beside still waters. A place where it's safe to enter, to drink. That's one of those things that we don't necessarily think about very often. You think about a river, the current, especially if there's been storms or whatever, how devastating that can be, how much can can pull and drag you under, other dangers that might be in the water or whatever. This place of turmoil that if you went in unwisely would just swarm over you and take control of you and destroy you. David says God knows the perfect places to bring you to water. The places to find comfort for the mind, peace. Those places to be able to get away from trouble and those that stir it up. Have those moments of quiet meditation where it's just you and God in prayer and study of His Word. And the result of those things, of where God is leading, David says, verse 3, refreshes my soul. Refreshes my soul. I like that wording. I know the old King James, restoreth my soul, but lack of a better way to say it, there's something refreshing about the terminology, refresh my soul. And it is a statement that David makes because the reality of life is everything else wears on our soul, doesn't it? The majority of things in life are pulling at us, tearing at us, wearing us down, making us tired, give out, want to give up. David says when you're following God, there's something refreshing about that, something that recharges you. I've made the comment before. I have had times where I have come to a worship service, whether that was a Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, where I was just tired. If I would have almost just as soon stayed home. That wasn't where I felt like going, but I went anyway. And when I left there, I was refreshed. I was glad that I got up off the couch and went. I was glad and grateful that God gave me a recharge when I was feeling so down and sluggish that I didn't want to start. When one comes to worship God, they always leave refreshed. God won't have it any other way. David says, He guides me along the right paths for His name's sake. And really, this is just another statement of recognition that David says, God, you have always had a plan for our lives. You created Adam and Eve in the garden, and you told them, here's how to live. You gave them a choice, and they made a wrong choice, but you told them the best way. Cain and Abel. He told them the best way to offer a sacrifice, even though that part's not recorded for us. One chose to follow God's direction, the other didn't. And we can go all the way through the Bible and find examples of both where people have chosen to do things the way God said to do it, and it worked out perfect every time. And every time they departed from where God said go, how God said to do it, they ran into trouble. Now, I want us to notice something else about these verses that we've looked at so far. David doesn't say God herds us. I work with cattle. I hardly ever work with sheep. I work with cattle. We herd cattle. Now, if you got some really good pets, you can lead them with a bucket of feed. But most cattle, you herd. You get behind them, you push them, you put pressure on different spots, you push and steer them to where you want them to go rather than saying, hey, follow me, and they follow your voice and go. David doesn't say that God herds us where he wants us to go. Doesn't say he pushes us to the places that we need to be. Rather, he uses the words, God guides. God leads. The importance of that is, again, this thought, I've got to choose to follow. If I don't choose to follow, I don't find the best pastures. I don't find the safe water. I don't find the restoring of my soul. I don't find these quiet places that I can get away from the drains of the world and be recharged by God. God calls. God tells us the right direction, and then he asks us to follow him. Verse 4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I know there will be people who will say, well, if God always has us in these great green pastures, and God always gets us to still water and does all these things, why do we have bad things happen in our lives? Two reasons. First one goes back to what I was just saying. God leads, and we have to choose to follow. Sometimes we have chosen not to follow, and we find ourselves in dangerous places, and bad things happen. And we have to listen for God calling us out of that to find our way back out of that bad area, back to where God has prepared for us. But I'll submit that the second reason is because the world is not divided up into one great big green giant pasture and a bad place. There's a good green pasture. There's a good green pasture. Sometimes there's a bad place in between the two. God, in order to get us from the one green pasture, as we begin sticking with the analogy of sheep, grazing that pasture off, needing to move to more good green pasture, sometimes you've got to go through a dark place to get to it. That's the part I can't always explain or in my limited knowledge know why it's the dark place that it is. Maybe 100,000 reasons for why it's the dark place it is. But just know that in this world, there are going to be those moments where to get to the next good place God has for you, we've got to go through something that's a little scary. But the beauty of what David says as he recognizes that is, I'm not walking through that dark place on my own. God is not leading me into a dark place. He's leading me through a dark place. Leading me to the next green pasture. And because of that, I'm not going to be afraid. I know I have the shepherd with me who has the rod and who has the staff, who has the knowledge of who my enemies are and how to defeat them. As a young boy, David defended his sheep from a lion and the bear, protected them. And so he understands, even though danger's nowhere to come to find me, even when I'm in the green pasture, the enemy's always trying to sneak in. But I have a shepherd who will always defend me, a shepherd who is greater than any enemy, who shines a light around me that is brighter than the dark place that I'm having to go through, who leads me out the other side. David begins to make a change here. This first half of the psalm was that kind of reflections based on his knowledge as a shepherd from his youth. He now begins to draw on his knowledge as a king. Verse 5, he says, "You prepare a table before me, the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." David had a lot of enemies. From the moment he was anointed to be the next king of Israel, the current king, Saul, sought to kill him. "You're not taking my throne. I'm going to put a stop to that." But he was fighting God, and so he wasn't able to do it. David was protected. Even after he became king, his own children at times tried to rise up against him. Enemies from foreign nations rose up against him. And David, throughout the Psalms, writes about these enemies and the challenges that he's facing. And there are a lot of times where David flat out asked God, "When are you going to destroy my enemies? When are you going to kill them? Solve this problem for me." But in this psalm, calling on that knowledge of a king, David says, "I recognize, God, that you are a higher authority than I am. You are a greater king. And you have prepared a feast and have invited me to it. As the host of that feast, I am under your protection. And even though my enemies may be sitting around the table looking at me, I can eat there safely because you protect me." Presence of my enemies, you have prepared a table before. What a understanding of finding peace in the midst of everything. And we have so much, as we've said all year, so much going on in this country and around the world. Troubles and struggles and things that we would call our enemy. Saw a little joke thing going around the internet the other day. God talking to one of his angels and said, "Did you get all of those events for the 20s scheduled?" The angel said, "For the 20s? Yeah, for the 20s. 20s as in plural? Yeah, for the 2020s. God, I think we have a problem. I thought you said for 2020. You put 10 years worth of troubles in 1 year? Uh-oh. That's kind of what this year's felt like, isn't it? It's still not bigger than what God can take care of. COVID, for whatever reason, it's a part of God's creation. Therefore, it is subject to God. How he chooses to use it, how he chooses to allow it, what he chooses to do about it, that's his territory. We live. We eat at the table God prepares us in the face of our enemy. People trying to persecute the church, trying to stop us from being able to teach and preach what God's word says. I eat at God's table in the presence of my enemies. And I leave him to deal with them because he's the host. David says, you have anointed my head with oil. The oil was a symbol. As the guest arrived, the host would anoint them with oil, probably in a company like we see with Jesus later with his apostles of washing the dust off of their feet. It was a symbol. I recognize and I accept you as a guest in my home and at my table. You are under my protection. David says, I am your anointed guest. And my cup overflows. You realize that the volume of God's blessings cannot be contained? Think about that. The blessings that God has waiting to pour out upon all of us can't be contained. Got to pour it in a cup, it overflows. We don't see them all, partly because of our own blindness, not pausing to see them. We don't see them all because some of them have been around for so long we've gotten accustomed to them just being there. We don't really see them as a blessing anymore. It's just the norm. Some of them we haven't seen yet because the timing is not right for God to pour it out yet. And then lastly, Psalm 23, verse 6. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. David expresses his desire and the conviction that he's making in his own heart, in his own mind, to remain with God. God, I need you as my shepherd. I need to eat where you tell me to eat. I need to drink where you tell me to drink. I need to be sustained in the way that you tell me to be sustained. I need to conduct my relationships the way that you tell me to conduct relationships. I need to conduct my business the way that you tell me to conduct business. I need to treat my enemies the way that you tell me to treat my enemies. And the list goes on and on. And God, I'm confident that if I do that, I will be your honored guest. You will protect me. And you will bless me. David's blessings are still the same blessings God has for us today. And when you go studying through Old Testament, there are a lot of promises in Old Testament that when you look at them applied only to the Israelites living under that covenant. David's not writing about those in this sense, this passage. David is writing about a relationship between the Creator and the created, between the king and his subjects. And it's applicable from Adam and Eve to the days of Noah, to the time of Abraham, to the time of David, to the time of Christ, to the time of what a God we have. What protection he offers. What blessings he's trying to pour out in our lives. I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions this morning as we finish out. Are you being led? Or are you trying to lead? Big difference when it comes to your relationship with God. God won't be led. He will lead you if you're willing to follow. Are you content? Recognizing God has given you everything that you need. If we don't get those extra wants, oh well. Content, because God has given me what I need. Are we protected in his presence? And have you been anointed as one of his protected guests? And that's where I guess the one difference, in a sense, comes in between David and us. David says, you anointed my head with oil. Today we are anointed with the blood of Christ. We're anointed through baptism into his death. Raised as new honored guests in the presence of God. We can help you with that in some way this morning. Finding your way back to God, being his honored guest, of being under his protection. And let us know as we stand together and sing. And tenderly, Jesus